Very happy to be with you as always. This has been an extremely enjoyable week for me here. And no less so this last moment of it, this last class. We'll go for about 2 hours. Probably take a very brief break in the middle if we get restless, or else we'll go all the way through, we'll see. I'll give you a chance to ask questions periodically. I'm going to try to present a certain understanding of this subject before I stop and ask for questions. Maybe the questions will be all at the end, I'm not sure. We'll just see how it goes. This is a very, very big and extremely important subject for everyone. But on the spiritual path, understanding this balance of feeling and reason, and the difference between feeling and emotion, devotion, emotion, feeling, reason, all of these factors, everything on the spiritual path eventually has to come into harmonious balance. And sometimes it's very tempting on the spiritual path to try to sort of cut out a costume of what it's supposed to look like and then put it on, imagining that spirituality is something we can wear from the outside. In the very early years of Ananda community in America, in the early 70s, it was a very tumultuous time in our society there when a lot of things changed. I'm sure the word baby boomers has even made it over to here, and you understand that. And we were just turning over a lot of systems and trying to find our way. Some of our ideas were completely loony. Others of them were actually good ideas. But when Swami Kriyananda started Ananda, he had a very elevated understanding of Master's teachings, of Sanatana Dharma. He'd lived in India. He was a citizen of the world already, very sophisticated understanding. And then there was us, which was mostly Americans in their 20s with just our own fantasy ideas. And people often imposed on the situation very odd realities. There was one woman who was she always wore white, which was more of an affectation in America than it is here, but she always wore white. She always carried one of Master's books. She always stood sort of piously looking at the ground. And then whenever anything would get too much for her, she'd just sort of open the book and then sigh a little bit, and then close the book. I thought there was something terribly wrong with me, because I thought she was the most uninteresting, boring person I had ever met. And meanwhile, I was running the kitchen and driving the truck and hauling 100-pound sacks of potatoes in and out of the kitchen. And I didn't know how else to behave. She didn't know how else to behave. Eventually, play acting, which is really what she was doing. And there was another woman of a similar type who had been one personality before she came on the path. As soon as she came on the path, she completely suppressed her personality and became someone completely other, and in the end had a slight nervous breakdown, from which she recovered. But when she recovered, the personality that she really was, again, to my mind, was so much more interesting and entertaining than the personality she had assumed for the time that she was there. Now, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna actually says to Arjuna, and the phrase is, what does it avail the devotee? How does it benefit the devotee just to suppress who you are? And the implication of that is that it simply doesn't work. Swami Kriyananda put it in another context. He said, if you suppress all your true feelings about things, they just pop out in some weird way later, unconnected to the true source. And if it worked, it would be fine, but it simply doesn't work. You just push it down, it comes out here. When it comes out here, you no longer know where it started, and dealing with it is even more confusing. At the same time, phrases like even-minded and cheerful, calm acceptance, and there's a kind of expectation on the spiritual path of a certain dignified relationship to the world in which screaming and crying and becoming completely carried away by emotions is not exactly the picture of the usual ashram. Even Ananda, exuberant as we are, still exercises that suppressive, slightly suppressive influence as people try to understand who I am supposed to be now that I'm trying to be a devotee. So I think really coming to a clear understanding of what the role of feeling is, and I'll explain in just a moment the distinction between feeling and emotion, and what we call this, how to work with all of these, is extremely important for your long-term success as a devotee, success as a person and success as a devotee. As I've said several times in all of these classes, we can't get to our ultimate spiritual goal from any place in the universe except right where we're standing. And Swami Kriyananda expanded that thought in saying, and the substance of who you are when you become a saint is exactly what's in you right now. It's not like we sort of go shopping and pick out all these nice characteristics. I would like to be a more quiet person. I would like to talk less. I would like to be less exuberant. And we sort of buy them and then paste them on. Whatever kind of a person you are now, whatever qualities you have, whatever inclinations, we need to develop those on a higher and higher level. We don't just turn them aside and become someone else. I have always been a very, very talkative person. And the idea that, that saints are silent, I just said even very early on, only half joking, that's not the kind of saint I'm going to be. I'm going to be a saint who has a lot of people over for tea and we talk every morning. That's just what we do. This is what I'm made of, and we can refine it, but we can't just cast it aside. And there's another aspect to that which I've watched over the years and lived through. It does not benefit you to be at war with yourself. We think sometimes that the way to transmute the qualities in us that we would like to see more elevated is to consider them our enemies. But they're really not our enemies because they are the very clay from which the new self is going to be built. They may be needed to be coaxed into another reality, but if we're divided against ourselves, that's not how God feels about us. Plus, it makes the inner atmosphere so tense. And to my experience, I've never seen it bring anything good to anyone. It just eventually brings more and more conflict instead of more and more resolution. Now, that's not to say that we can just sort of drift like a leaf on a calm stream into God realization. An enormous amount of introspection, of ever more sophisticated self-understanding, of redirecting of our energy is absolutely required. But you're not at war with yourself. We are simply working together with God to take the raw material of who I am and bring it up to what I really want it to be. The quality of feeling is in fact the fundamental quality of the universe. When we talk about the divine, we always use the word bliss, Satchidananda, ever existing, ever conscious, ever new joy, ever new bliss. The quality of bliss is a feeling quality. It's not just an idea. And when we define God and experience Him within us, it comes to us as a feeling quality. It's not just some sort of dry idea. And it's ever existing, ever conscious, but also ever new bliss. And our intuition itself, Swami Kriyananda describes, perfect intuition, he says, is perfectly calm feeling. That that aspect of our nature is not something that we're trying to leave behind or to overcome or to denigrate in any way. That's the feminine half. The feminine side is the feeling side. The masculine side is the reason side. I'm not talking about men and women. I'm talking about divine dualities. And they're both sides of the same coin. But reason without feeling will not take you to God. And feeling that is not kept in a state of reason, as Yogananda puts it, will also not take us to God. But both are essential. Feeling is what motivates us to do anything about this. People who are very intellectual on their spiritual path, who just like to read books and then ask complicated questions that have very little practical application, don't ever really progress far. I recently had an amusing conversation with Swamiji in one of the informal discussions in the living room of our house in our community. Somebody brought up the fact that Yogananda said he remembers all the way back to the point when that individual jiva that became Paramhansa Yogananda was at the level of a diamond. I mean, that is, I don't know where to go, even think about that thought. I've heard it said that crystals, of which gemstones are an example, are the transition between matter and energy. It's when matter begins to become conscious, more conscious. But I still don't know what it means. So when we were discussing this, someone said to me, how long does it take to get out of being a diamond? And where do you go next? You know, is the diamond the highest stone? Do you become an emerald after that? Do you become a redwood tree? You know, is a redwood tree more advanced than an oak tree? Just sort of all those questions. So I said, I have no idea, but if I have a chance to ask Swamiji, I'll ask him that question. So I was sitting at breakfast with him and we were just having casual conversation, so I brought it up one day. And he looked at me and he said, that is the stupidest question I've ever heard, just like that. I was not deflected. I said, I thought it was really interesting, Swamiji. And then he sort of went back to his eggs and toast for a few minutes. And then finally he said, in eternity, there is no time. And so if it takes a long time to come out of being a diamond to become a self-realized master, that time was a dream anyway. It's always eternally now at all times, and it just appears to be a long time. So that was his first answer. But the second answer, he said, what will you do with that information? You know, how will that information actually help your spiritual life? Now, that was not, I still defended my interest in it, but nonetheless, there are many questions that we fascinate our minds with that we imagine are the important issues. But oftentimes when we get too intellectual about our spiritual path, there's not enough feeling quality happening. Because you see, it's the feeling quality that causes us to move forward. Intellectual ideas like how long did it take to be a diamond and what happens after you're a diamond and so on like that, there's no hunger in that question. You're entertaining yourself, and I was entertaining myself, but there's no hunger there. It's exactly as if a very good restaurant, let's just say that instead of the Breathe Gym next door to us, we actually had an excellent restaurant. And we had the menu and we kept it on the table here. No matter how often we read the menu, we might even have memorized the menu, but we wouldn't even walk out the gate to go next door unless we were hungry. It's just an intellectual interest until there's a feeling that moves you. And ultimately, it's the feeling that really moves you, kept in a state of reason, but reason alone won't move you forward. So, I mean, we can call it Shakti, we can call it the woman behind the great man, we can call it all sorts of things, but in ourselves we know. You know, there comes a point on the spiritual path where you don't really need to understand very much, because you're so hungry you don't care. You don't need to know this one compared to that one and this and that. You just want somebody to feed you. So even Sri Yukteswar, who is considered to be the Gyan avatar, whom Yogananda described in that way, cold spiritual mathematics was his way of understanding. In his book, The Holy Science, which I will say, confess to having read, but have really to this day have very little understanding of what the book says, except for the words, not the meaning. But even in the end, he says, without love, you can't take a single step forward on the spiritual path. Because without hunger, you won't even reach out your hand to have something to eat. Now, the problem in life is that so many of our feelings, we're hungry, but we're not just hungry for God. We're hungry for all sorts of things, for excitement, for self-justification, for control over others, for the opportunity to express ourselves, for the need to be heard. It goes on and on and on. We want to be depressed, we want to be elated. And a lot of the pure feeling that would really just draw us to God, in fact, spins us out in all kinds of directions. Now, the solution is not, as I was saying at the beginning, to dress in white clothes and to carry a little book around and then sigh and then read it all the time, and every time anything annoying happens, just cite some little aphorism and then go sadly off on our way. Because sooner or later, if we're suppressing our true nature, even Krishna said, the reason that's not a good idea is a really simple one. It doesn't work. It would be just great if we could all go down to the casting department and get our little saint clothes on and just wear them like a bodysuit. But instead we have to, as I was saying, we have to make our sainthood out of who we are, and all of the roiling, confused feelings within us all have to be, lifted, focused, refined, until they become that perfect love for God. So relax. Just accept that this is what we're going to have to do. And being at war with ourselves, what that means is not that we're not striving to bring that which is not helpful to us under control, but there's no value in revolting against it, in being rebellious against the way we're made. Women tend to be more emotional than men, but not necessarily. Women tend to be more in touch with their emotions and their feelings. But often for men, the project is to understand their feeling nature, and for women, usually the project is to redirect that feeling nature. But that doesn't make the project any more difficult for either side. It's just the way it is. So, I want to start, I put a board here because there's just a few concepts. Can all of you see this? Do I need to move it? Is there anyone who can't see this? Okay. I'm not going to write so much up here that it matters, but sometimes it helps to get a few words on the board. In English, in the English language, the word feeling and the word emotion don't really have clearly different meanings. But for the sake of the discussion, when we're talking from the point of view of yoga, it's very important to understand them as two separate concepts, because pure feeling is our divine nature, but emotions are something quite else. So if we talk first about feeling, the reason, again, I want to make the distinction is simply this. Because the male side of ourselves, and I'll talk about it as masculine and feminine and not men and women, because the male energy expressing through us, usually this is how men are. I've certainly learned it from my husband. Let me think about this, how to say this. Much of the time when a soul decides to incarnate as a male person, it's because he's interested in that masculine ability to make things happen in this world. Swami Kriyananda, as many of you know, back in 1962, came into a great conflict with the people who were leading then the YSS SRF organization. It's a big, long story, an interesting one, but not the subject of our class. It had many reasons, but one of the reasons was the leadership was entirely female. He was the only man. And he had, from his guru, inherited this commission as a man to make a great deal happen in the world. That's masculine energy is required, whether it comes through a man or a woman, to manifest in the world. Feminine energy tends to be more experiential, tends to draw things to a focus. Again, forget men and women. This is feminine and masculine, like this. Swami Kriyananda's naturally male energy was completely misunderstood by the women. They just didn't understand what he was doing, and they completely misread his motives. With my husband, from whom I've learned a lot about men, as well as learning it from Swami Kriyananda, oftentimes I've tried to engage him in the small nuances of things that were happening. And instead of being interested in those, I've been a little surprised that he'll kind of push them aside. And it's taken me time to realize masculine strength comes from keeping your eye on the horizon line and not paying attention to all the little things that are in front of you. Whereas the woman tends to be always interested in all the little things like this, right? You know, the woman is the moon. The moon waxes and wanes and waxes and wanes and waxes and wanes. In the course of 30 days, it does the whole thing and pays attention to every little piece. The man is the sun. Very slowly over the course of a year, it'll shift a little bit. But that's where the power comes from. The power comes from not being all drawn into these small pieces. However, if the masculine, in the effort to keep its eye on the horizon line and not get distracted, does that by suppressing feeling, it tends to make him brittle and incomplete in his understanding, sometimes lacking in intuition. Certainly it makes it difficult for him and his wife to get along, or for him to understand his daughters. At the same time, it took me a while to understand, and I credit my husband with teaching me this, the emotional activity of a woman that she often just lives and thrives on is not attractive to a man as a rule. And in fact, I went through a cycle of marriage counseling where, I wasn't my own marriage, but I was counseling other people's marriages. And there was just like God wanted me to understand this. And, you know, woman and man, woman and man, woman and man, they kept coming. And I mostly counsel people that I also know, so I have more awareness of what's going on in their lives than just what they bring into the room. And in virtually every case, the woman was saying to me, he's almost a perfect husband, except this one small area. And that one small area was the fact that he was a man. And to her, if he would just get this little tiny piece, then everything would be just perfect. I, of course, knew that if he got that little tiny piece and ceased being a man, not only would he be very unhappy, but she wouldn't like him. Because then he wouldn't be what he was. You know, very complicated. Everybody's wrong is what it really is. I'll give you one more on the woman's side and then I'll go on. Swami Kriyananda years ago, we still have them, these little books, The Secrets of Friendship, The Secrets of Love. They're very nice little books. They were a very financially beneficial product for our publishing company for a period of time. Oddly enough, we were one of the first publishers to start putting out those little books. For a short period of time, we had a corner on the market and we brought in a lot of income, much needed income. So the man who was selling these books said to Swami Kriyananda, women are the people who buy these books. And if you had a book called Secrets for Women, it would sell really, really well. Swami Kriyananda's first response was, I can't write that book. Just like that. Then the next morning, as often happens when he says no to something or I can't, Master gives him the understanding. The next morning he woke up, he said he just felt like a woman. He was completely in feminine consciousness. And for 3 days he wrote the book, a very good book. And he wrote, I mean, these are little books, so for 3 days he wrote the book. In the middle, occasionally he would be interrupted with a phone call. He spoke of one specific, where people wanted him to focus his mind and make certain decisions. He said, I can't. He said, because I'm a woman now, and I can't think in that way. He said, you'll have to call me after I finish this book. So he finished the book, and he came back to himself. And please understand this in the right way, which I'm sure you do. And then he sort of said to a lot of his women friends, I became completely involved in feminine consciousness, you know, all that feeling, all that emotion. It was terrible. He said, I much prefer being a man. He said, I think I've been a man for a long time. Yeah. No one who knows him, you know, thinks that he's either prejudiced or deficit in feeling, because of course he has the tenderest of hearts and the greatest of devotion. But emotion is something entirely different. And so that's what I want to get, the distinction between feeling and emotion. And for the purposes of our discussion, understanding that feeling is highly desirable, but that emotion is an aberration on feeling. And this is the way to think about it. This is somewhat arbitrary, but it works. Okay? I'm going to draw a picture up here. The nature of feeling, as I was saying at the beginning, is that it is our divine nature. When we come to God realization, when we love God, when we expand beyond our egos, feeling is what's there, love, bliss, and so on. So you can say in a sense that feeling is the trunk of the tree, that it's rooted in our divine self, and it's the power that enables us to live and to move. It's what makes us hungry. It makes us hungry to have a family, it makes us hungry to have a success in life, to have friends, to explore creativity. Without feeling, you're not motivated. We have that perfectly clear. And the more feeling you have, the more powerful you're feeling, the more deep, let's use the word as if we were going down, the more deep your energy can reach. And the more deep the source of your feelings, the more powerful those feelings are. Deep meaning sense, deep into your own consciousness, you know, deep into the source of our being. The tree is nurtured from the earth. It draws its power from the source. So when that feeling gets strong, it makes the tree itself. Now, a tree is not merely a trunk. A tree is all the branches that extend out from it. Where I live, there's some very large, very beautiful trees. There's this huge elm tree that to my mind, it's the guru tree of the property. And it has just, you're way over here looking at some beautiful leaves, and you realize that they've emanated from a trunk quite some distance from it. Now, every branch of the tree, no matter how far it extends, it's nurtured from the same source, isn't it? And in a real sense, there's nothing different between the branch and the trunk. It's one continuous flow of life energy. It's one identifiable being. It comes out like this. Now, not only do we have the branches, but every tree has zillions of leaves, and it might even have little flowers. It has all of these other things that all grow on the branches too. But every one of those, you can see, emanates still from the same source. Because if it were cut off here, then all of this would cease to exist. Isn't that true? There's no way that the periphery of it can grow except from the center. Now, the difference between feeling and emotion is that the trunk is the feeling, and feeling can extend all the way out to the child in the school where you're the teacher, and this little child becomes an enormous concern of yours. It's moved way out from the source of your being, but still it's activated, it's nurtured, it's your motivation for taking care of it, stems from this source. And as long we can do anything we want in the world from the source of our feeling. But when we move out to these peripheral expressions of feeling and consider them realities in themselves and disconnect them from the source, that's when feeling shifts over into emotion. Okay? We could have a desire, for example, to have a family. And, God could give us a family. We have this happy family here, and it lives in a little house, and it's very happy over here. If we always recognize that as an expression of our love for God, if we recognize it as a gift, that's something that God has given to us, even the answer to a prayer that we have, but we always see it in connection to here, then we're always centered. There's always a point of power from where we stand. And even if the wind blows and this becomes extremely chaotic, as long as we're still standing in the root, you can see how the tree can handle all of this. If instead we have moved away from the source and have defined this as its own unique reality, the winds start blowing and you're just holding on to the end of the branch and you're being whipped around, you have no anchor point in the source of where this came from, but are trying to be steady right here, or even worse, something happens and the branch breaks, and this little piece of reality goes to the ground like that, and you have lost yourself, the connection with the source. What happens to us? We fall to the earth, don't we? Several of you have spoken to me very poignantly about loved ones, older or younger, that you really cared about, that for whom you had great feeling. But that feeling shifted from being an extension of your relationship to God into being a reality unto itself. And this is always very dangerous because of death. So if this is my life, this is cut off, this plunges downward, where am I now? This is emotion, this is feeling. Now the power of this is, you see, there's no aspect of life that you can't participate in fully. It's fascinating to realize when I look at the elm tree in our property that it is fully engaged in the last leaf of the last branch. Because there's no possible way that last leaf of the last branch could exist if it wasn't being animated from the trunk. And so the tiniest little thing, I want new windows for my little house, because if I have new windows in my house, it'll be a warmer, more loving place for the family. We can have a hunger for more light and beauty in our house. And the same tree can animate even this little thing, as long as we are connected to the feeling of it. This is why, interestingly enough, Swami Kriyananda, who is the biggest advocate of simple living that I know and the least attached person that I know, always has a very refined home. He always has aesthetic things around him. He doesn't endlessly buy. He doesn't always shift around. He doesn't just sort of do it restlessly. But he understands that part of being a tree is to create a refined atmosphere. And truthfully, he knows he can walk away from any place that he lives and he would never, ever, ever look back. Because he's never defined his reality by the feeling of attachment, or I would be unhappy if I didn't have it, or I must have this environment or else I won't be comfortable. How could I be expected to live in thus and so place? Nothing. It's just an emanation of his sense of beauty and relationship to God. Comes all the way out here. All that I'm saying is you can go all the way out to the edge. And this is how we become enormous in the divine instead of being afraid. When I was first on the spiritual path, it was very easy at Ananda village to be detached from material things because we had none. We had so little of anything. Our community, for those of you who've been to the Pune community, looked a little like the Pune community, only worse. Because at least there's a few nice buildings. We had very few. We just had a few domes. And we had a little temple and so on. But for many years, I lived in a very small trailer. That was probably the width of this room, maybe a little shorter. Just barely bigger than this. I couldn't actually touch the walls. Somebody slightly bigger than me could have. And then I could just walk up the middle and I would sleep, I would meditate, I would do a little bit of cooking, I would sit here and eat my meal. And I just moved like a line like that. I never had dinner parties, But I was perfectly happy. I had everything I needed. And it also comforted me to not have anything. Because then I didn't have to even ask the question about attachment. I found out that being very poor is easy. Being very rich, although I've never experienced it, is probably easy. The middle ground is the tough one, where you have enough money to imagine that you can fulfill some of your desires, but not enough to fulfill all of them. When we had nothing, the question of desire never arose. It was just completely like, why go there? You can't buy anything, so just don't need anything. But a certain inner reality began to grow in me that is left over from those cave-dwelling years. That as long as I didn't have any material things, that meant I was spiritual. In other words, there was no question of having refined my feelings. I was in that story of I'll just push them aside and consider them transcended. But of course, they weren't transcended. They were just in abeyance, just waiting to fall on my head. And then by a series of events, I married David, and suddenly we needed a place to live, and Swami Kriyananda, the area around Swami Kriyananda's house was being redeveloped, and there was this little tiny cabin there, very funky little cabin, and he invited us to come and live next door to him, which of course was something highly desirable, and he asked, can we live in this little cabin? My husband is a very energetic man. He has a very big aura. The two of us walked into that cabin. I felt like his aura pinned me against the wall. And there was room for him to walk around in there, but there was no room for me. It did not feel like a wholesome place for us. It's odd, because normally I would have just said yes, but it wasn't right. So Swamiji said, well, build a house there. There was two purposes to this, because we didn't have any money. And so he said, well, why don't you travel and lecture, Asha, and then you can earn the money. And I never would have done that. Except that was his way of picking me up by the seat of the pants and throwing me out into the world. So I started that work, which turned out to be, well, here we are. So you can see where that one went. But then we had to build this little house. And I've explained to you in another context, or maybe in another city, about my husband has taught me a lot, because to him, he doesn't break the world up into pieces. To him, it's all energy. He doesn't see material things, non-material, spiritual, non-spiritual. To him, it's one flow of energy. That's what I learned from him. It's all energy. So if you live in a nice house, fine. If you live in another house, fine. It just doesn't make any difference to him. It's all energy. So he was asked to build a house. He has a very fine aesthetic sense. He started designing a very attractive house. First, he started designing the Taj Mahal. I had to say, honey, I don't know what incarnation you think we're in, but it's not that one, I promise you. Just like he was way out there. No, dear, I don't really think that's where we are now. We're not rich anymore. Other lifetimes, yes, not this lifetime. Sometimes I joke with him, boy, if we had done all this work for ourselves, we'd be so wealthy by now. But not this time. But so we got it down to the right size, and it's now the guest house at Crystal Hermitage. Some of you who may go there may see it. It's a charming little house, small, much smaller than this one, but a very nice house. But I had this enormous emotional attachment, of all things, to being impoverished. Most people have attachment to having things, but my attachment was to being impoverished. I had made this little leaf way out here at the edge, And this little leaf said, as long as she's poor, she's spiritual. As long as people can come in and say, how can you live in this tiny little dump? And I could say, see how spiritual I am? Like that, right? This was not an inspiration from God. This was an emotion I had built around here, a peculiar one, but just as binding as if I had been attached, you see? And David felt, Swamiji wants us to build this house. You know, as devotees, it behooves us to reflect the beauty of God. There's nothing particularly spiritual about having nothing. It can be a sign of not putting out enough energy. So finally, I came up with another sort of secondary little emotional plan, which is that we would build an ugly house. And then it would be perfectly clear that I couldn't possibly have been attached to building this house because look how badly it's done. And he put up with that quietly for a while. And then one day said, if you're not going to help, then at least get out of the way. And that was when I began to really realize, you know, what is this all about? What am I really doing? You know, I was pretending that this was a divine feeling because it was all about being spiritual. But I had really moved away from intuition, from the guidance of Swami Kriyananda, even from common sense, because my emotions had made a reality of some tiny peripheral part, and I was no longer seeing the whole. You see? So it's many different ways. So I just took it all down. I still didn't really work on the house very much because I wasn't that interested, but I did. I chose the wallpaper and a few things like that, and I began to discover this is fun, that all of these leaves are not spiritual at all if they emanate from here. Well, Divine Mother, here we are in the wallpaper store. In my own life, a place I never expected to go ever. I'm in the wallpaper store, and there's all this wallpaper. You know, what reminds me of my own inner feelings of happiness? What represents to me what I want to be all the time? Because when you're looking at beautiful things, or you're looking at art, or you're looking at anything like that, these are all feeling realities. And when you come at them with too much reason, well, that's the cheapest, you know, or we don't want that one because our neighbors have that one, whatever it might be, we cut ourselves off from the core. But instead, when we stand in any reality, and this is what I was saying my husband David was teaching me, okay, you know, what is this asking for right now? How can we make whatever it is we're doing, whether we're building a house, whether we're making lunch, whether we're trying to raise our child, whether we're teaching in a school, how can we make it a true emanation of that inner feeling of the divine that is in me at all times? And then every little leaf begins to vibrate with that reality. And we are living in our feeling nature, but we're not caught up in the emotional side. Now, let me stop for a moment and ask if we have understanding. Are there any questions that need to be answered in regard to that before I go on? Yes.
This question, you know, I've been contemplating ever since we met, but I think I'll ask, I mean, how to control your emotions on the devotional path?
How to keep track between emotion and devotion?
Swamiji always says that women have all the potential, you know, for God realization, much better than men have, but then they, you know.
Women have it in quantity and men have it in quality, that's how he says. More women come on the path, but more men become great.
Yes.
Because it's natural for women to have that feeling quality, but it's not natural for women to be able to have that masculine look.
Take it up.
I'm going to probably not answer that quite yet, because I think I want a little more context before I come back to that one. So let's see if there's another. Sumita.
See, intellectually this concept sounds very, you know, like I have been able to understand what you, not understand, but let's say hear what you're saying.
Right.
But how you actually relate it to your real life, in reality,
Mm-hmm.
in practicality, that is where I'm still grappling, you know. See, for example, I'll give you a situation. Usually we are all on that thing which is at the end of the branches.
We're living out here.
Yeah, we're living here. And most of all of us have fallen down until unless, you know, we have been spiritually very, very ahead. But in most of the cases, we have fallen down and then we have tried to come back and find out that what is actually the source of it. So how to avoid that, or maybe how to preempt that if I have put my words correctly.
Okay, you're all asking me for what I would say anyway, so instead of letting you ask any more questions, I think I'll just go on. I had a feeling that would happen, but I thought I'd try. Okay, now, let me think for a minute here. There's a couple of words. There's a word that is often used in spiritual life, which is the word attachment. And people say you shouldn't be attached, you should be detached, and so on like that. I actually find this word a little confusing. When I first married David, our circumstances were such that he had a job that caused him to travel a lot, and he would leave and, pardon me.
I'm sorry, I'm actually something on this also. Say for me, my understanding, and it can be wrong, is that the feelings come only because of attachment.
Right, exactly.
Because if I'm not attached, or let's say I'm detached or distanced, then that feeling and that, or let's say that engagement or the drive will not be there.
That's exactly where I was going. So you read my mind perfectly. When David and I were first married, and I had to make a lot of decisions in order to marry him because I did not plan to marry, so it was a big deal for me to marry him. Big change in my life. So he was away for about 3 weeks soon after we were married. And I missed him just terribly. The 3 weeks went on, it seemed like half a year to me, especially toward the end. And so I just was talking to one of my friends, and he said something, now be careful, don't get attached. I just looked at him just like what you're saying. Do you think I would have turned my life upside down if I wasn't attached? Of course I'm attached. What a stupid thing to say to me at this point. It may be true, but it's not a helpful way to think about it for exactly the reason that you're saying. If we didn't have a strong feeling of connection and force moving us here, we wouldn't bother. Because all of these things we get involved in, not the least of which is each other, takes a lot of time and energy, and it's not always fun. Seems like a lot of fun at the beginning, but later on turns into something else. Okay. So, but then you try to be detached, but what would happen if the trunk of the tree tried to detach itself from all these leaves? It would never become a beautiful tree. And that is when you see the fruits of certain ways of thinking, you can tell whether that is right thinking or not. So you see people who, in the name of being spiritual, hold themselves aloof. They hold themselves aloof from their own children. They hold themselves aloof from their family. They hold themselves aloof from the work they're doing. And even though it sounds good, I'm trying not to be attached, it doesn't feel good. And you can tell that even though it looks right, it should be right, it's not working. And if you think of it like this, if the trunk decides I'm getting too committed to these leaves, I'm just going to cut some of them off and let them die, the tree would not be fulfilling the destiny for which it was born. And so it is with all of us. We have a karmic destiny. It's not an impersonal destiny. The reason we're driven by our feelings, the reason we're hungry for marriage, for work, for creative self-expression, for money, is not because those things in themselves are really going to satisfy our hunger, but because one, some part of us believes that they will, but more than that, our desires, again, are not our enemies. It doesn't serve you to be at war with yourself. Our desires are given to us by God to force us to put out the energy, to give us the experiences we need to grow. And we won't grow by suppressing them, because they're not transcended by suppressing. They're transcended by facing, often living through. Sometimes they can be faced merely as energy and dissolved, but for most of us they have to be lived through. Part of what we live through also is the fact that and this is the word I wanted to use, we begin to identify ourselves, and identify is the word that I find much more helpful than the word attachment. Because what we really need to do in our life, with all of the branches and all of the leaves that our own karmic compulsions demand of us, so that we'll have the experiences we'll need to be able to grow even larger and more beautiful. But when I say here that when the feeling comes all the way out and it comes out to the leaf and then it becomes an emotion, because our happiness begins to depend on what happens to this one leaf. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't experience elation and depression or satisfaction or disappointment because of what happens to this one leaf. But when our actual either sense of self-worth, our purpose in being alive, or our ability even to feel any kind of joy is dependent upon what happens to this one leaf, that's when we have moved from a pure expression of feeling again into an emotion. Another way of saying that is we have identified ourselves with a limited reality instead of merely expressing ourselves into this reality as the natural expression from our source. So you can be completely committed, heart, mind, and soul, to something or someone, whether it's creative work, the people in your lives, the responsibilities you have, without identifying yourself exclusively as those realities. The tree always knows that this is just one leaf, but yet it commits itself completely to the entire process of making that leaf the best leaf it can make. That's what I love. I watch the tree all the way out to the edge, all the way out to this one, and the whole story is happening out here. Exactly the same. He's not shirking. I think that tree is a man. He's not shirking. He's responsible for it. He's karmically destined to do it. He's hungry to make that leaf. But I don't think the tree actually gets confused about the source of his happiness, the nature of his relationship to that leaf. Okay? Now, how do you control the inclination to go here is essentially the whole spiritual path. And I'm not going to just leave you with that. I'll give you a little bit more. But if you can even begin to understand sort of what the possibility is here, and understand in a wholesome way how we can live completely, but not limit our identity to a small reality. Now this still leaves us, I think the word is enormously vulnerable. A lot of people who want to talk about attachment and detachment, one of the reasons why, and I don't want to say universally, but so often it does not make for an attractive person, is the actual origin of this desire to be detached is fear. It's the fear of being hurt. And reason follows feeling. Feeling is, I don't want to get involved because in past lives I've been hurt. And this is how I've decided to deal with hurt, is that I'll just cut off my relationship. I won't make as many leaves. Or if I do make leaves, I'll make them badly. Because often a person in this reality is in a state of war with themselves. So their karmic condition pushes them into situations in which they need to be committed, but their fear of being hurt, sometimes coupled with a little bit of spiritual philosophy, which a little can be dangerous, causes us to play out this idea that I'm detached, when what I actually am is I am uncommitted because of the fear that if I commit myself, I become vulnerable. Now, the only way to avoid that is not by doing it badly. Swami Kriyananda also said to me once, you don't get out of karma by doing it badly. Because if you're doing it badly, then you are being tamasic in the way that you're doing it. You're allowing the darkening, dulling quality of this creation to dominate your Rajasic, Sattvic energy, your dynamic energy and your peaceful energy. You might be pretending that that's a very spiritual quality. But if the origin point is fear, which almost always it is, because you see, if you're genuinely detached, you're not afraid of anything. Swami Kriyananda once remarked about himself, referring to a man who was a little bit caught in this syndrome here. He said, so-and-so appears to be more detached than I am. He said, but in fact, he's just withholding his feelings. He said, whereas I may appear to be more attached, he said, because I have no fear of putting out my feelings, because even if the whole branch gets severed, there may be even many tears. Something, I remember once in Swami's life, something that he really thought could happen and would create a tremendous amount of positive energy. The people that he was relying on could not rise to what he was asking. And instead, you know, not everything that we all, even Ananda tries, always succeeds. It just collapsed. And he became very, very sad on one level. But he wasn't sad for himself. He was sad because he'd seen a beautiful possibility and it wasn't going to happen. And he was sad for the people who hadn't been able to do it. But he had never defined himself by that particular branch, so he was able to just go back and stand in the tree here. So let's see, I lost my thought for just a moment. Oh yes, when you really are not afraid because you never let your feelings become boxed in as emotions, then you can give 100% of your feeling to everything that you do. And this is the example, especially on our path. Some paths are different, you know, but we are following this line of teaching. We're following Swami Kriyananda's example. Of course, you all know Swamiji a little bit later in his life, and we didn't know Master at all. But look at all that Swami has accomplished. Do you think he's been able to accomplish all that much if he had the fear of getting attached? If he had the fear of the commitment of energy that was required? I remember a woman was having trouble with a particular man in our community. And he was a difficult guy to get along with. There was no question. And she wrote to Swamiji all about the trouble she was having with him. And Swami wrote back, "Oh, he just wants to be your friend. Just love him." She wrote back, she said, "I don't want to be that good." This is true advice, but I'm going to hold on right here, because I haven't even talked about negativity. You know, sometimes what we're holding on to is negativity. It's not anything positive. I don't want to give that person, that job, that situation, my true feeling. Instead, I want to enjoy the fact that that person is icky and I don't have to do it like that. Well, again, what if the tree decided that this particular leaf, you know, just didn't deserve to be supported? I mean, how could the tree make such a decision? But we're always making such decisions, aren't we? Because the pure feeling goes out and it just meets a block. And it says, I'm just not going to go beyond this because I've identified myself with my limits, my boundaries, my right to be angry. And a lot of times, it's so exquisite, we're right. This leaf really is icky, really, really icky, behaving very badly, doing nothing to earn the beautiful gift that that we might give. But we become attached just as easily to that feeling of self-justification, that feeling of rightness, and we imagine we'll feel better if we hold on to those boundaries. Now, none of this is easy to overcome. But what makes it possible to overcome it is we become hungry. We begin to hurt in our own hearts for these things that are going badly. And we become hungry for another kind of experience. And without that hunger, people can talk to you forever about these ideas. But somewhere in us, how did my friend put it? Oh, I love the way she put it. Don't even think about trying to overcome a negative quality in yourself until you are absolutely disgusted with it, is how she put it. If a little part of it still pleases you. I had a conflict with someone that just went on for a long, long time. You know, you live with the same people for 40 years. You think marriage is something. Man, you've got guru bhais, and there's so many of them. And I mean, marriage, at least when you die, you're finished, right? Guru bhais, incarnation after incarnation, you know. And there's so many of them, you know. So you really get to work out all of this stuff really terrifically. I had this one relationship, you know, I've been 40 years, so when I say it lasted for 20 years, that means it's long since passed. I mean, people gasp when I say, oh yeah, we just had a conflict for about 20 years. This woman once told me that the first 28 years of her marriage were hell, and then after that it got better. You know? But she was speaking from about the year 40, and she was perfectly happy. Yeah, the first 28 years were hell. I mean, at the time, I wasn't even 28. I was 20, so I couldn't even imagine 28 years of hell, but it had worked. It had worked out in the end. So I had about 20 years of conflict with this person, and finally one day, I got so tired of it. But I finally realized that I wasn't tired of it at all. I actually really enjoyed the kind of, I was pretty sure that I was being mistreated. And actually, in fact, I always call this, to make it worse, I was right. I was actually being mistreated, you know, and so, but God doesn't care whether you're right or not. He cares whether or not you've built an emotional box around some particular reality that blocks the flow of pure feeling. And I finally realized that I enjoyed being mistreated because I thought of all the things that it gave me. It gave me the sense of self-righteous superiority, gave me a reason always to feel a little sorry for myself. It justified a whole lot of really stinky attitudes on my part. Well, of course I feel this way because that's how they're treating me. Kind of things like that. None of which had anything to do with pure feeling. All of which were walking out from pure feeling and setting up these little leaves and then worshiping them. Just setting up this little sort of worship of them. Now, I'm talking about 20 years. How did I ever finally overcome that? By falling into it, crawling out. Falling into it, crawling out. Falling into it, crawling out. I mean, you can imagine, I'm not going to draw enough lines to tell you how many times I did it. But knowing, once I got here, that I really didn't want to be there. Okay, don't even think about giving up a bad habit until you're absolutely disgusted with it. I mean, we get a lot of pleasure from these things. They give us pleasure in a lot of complicated ways. That's why you can't be at war with yourself. And here's another thing I really think is very important. People will say to me, they'll describe to me some situation in their life, and then they'll go like this, oh, I know it's stupid to feel that way. I know it's stupid to feel that way. No, actually, I don't think it's stupid at all. In fact, you spent a lot of lifetimes working yourself into this situation. You've committed the best and the brightest energy you have to get you right to here. Now, whether that is an emotionally volatile or chaotic conflict with someone, whether it's a profound disappointment that seems to be out of your control, such as, for example, the most difficult people have to deal with, the death of someone who's very close to you. You know, you spent a lot of time getting yourself right into that karmic moment. In the story of the life of Jesus, just before the climactic end of his life in which he was crucified and then resurrected. I mean, the whole story of Jesus is based on that. And he knew it was coming. And the night before, he went into the Garden of Gethsemane, and there's these just poignantly beautiful, you know, biblical passages about that time. But one of the things he says, you know, is, does this have to happen, Lord? And he's not trying to protect his body. He was a self-realized master. His body meant nothing to him. What he was praying about was the very people he'd come to help were the ones who are now crucifying him. And it was their karma and their rejection of his message that was breaking his heart. That's what was hurting him. And he was praying to God, is there no other way? These are his disciples. Can I help them in some other way? And he said, save me from this hour. Save me from the heartbreak of this hour. But then he says after that, but for this hour was I born. My whole incarnation is coming to a focus in this dramatic experience which will live for centuries. For this hour was I born. Oh, you read that about the great avatar and all that's happened because of that. But here's the odd and interesting thing. For this hour were each of us born. Whatever moment we are standing in right now is the culmination of countless incarnations of right and wrong effort. Clearly at least some right effort, because here we are. To even be here in front of these masters means that we have put out tremendous right energy for a long time. But however our energy has focused, whether it's in grief, resentment, anger, bliss, disappointment, lack of self-control, we have been applying every ounce of our willpower and all the possible energy right for that moment. And it does not serve you to say in that moment, oh, it's stupid to feel that way. I put it this way. We have to have great respect for our delusions. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Maya. I do not just dismiss it. And I do not dismiss my own misunderstandings as foolish, because I'm not foolish. None of us are foolish. And I worked very, very hard, as I put it, to get this confused. And I thought it was a good idea. And I'm not going to be able to unravel it by being at war with myself or being disrespectful of the intensity of what brought me to here. Now, at the same time, I don't want to take it too seriously, because no matter how strong and brilliant a flower it might be, this is who I really am. But I have to recognize that I have to work patiently and kindly, unrelentingly, uncompromisingly, with all of my willpower, but I have to exert the same amount of willpower to unravel this that I have exerted to create it. And I found just that simple thought, that no matter how stupid it may seem to me after 20 years to still be holding on to this little self-justification, I have to stand back and say, well, look at you, you are. So what that means simply is that I have to put out more energy. And it is in itself an emotional response to say, I have to get over this, I can't stand it, I won't want to do it anymore. And Swamiji used to criticize me, and I never understood it. He said, feeling guilty and weeping about it is not the same as actually doing something about it. And I used to answer with tears, well, but I'm so upset, But I was just creating another layer of emotion instead of just calmly recognizing, well, this is a deep misunderstanding. I had an experience once with a karma that I thought I had overcome. But in fact, it had just kind of gone underground. And because I had felt a certain freedom with that karma, I put myself in a position of, temptation might be the right word, where that karma could easily resurrect itself. And within a matter of hours, I was fully sucked into the emotions of it again. And I was actually crying to Swami, oh, I thought I was over this, and look, here we are again. Very matter-of-factly, he said, well, it's good that you know. He said, you weren't putting out any energy to overcome it, and now you know it's still a problem for you. That's good news. Oh, yeah, I guess it is, isn't it? Every time one of these things reveals itself, it's just the fruit of your Kriya. It's the fruit of your Kriya saying, oh, look at this. Look at who you are. And so we have to work on these. Swamiji is so calm and disinterested in emotions about emotions. A friend of mine once did something that was careless, and as a consequence, it caused a certain amount of significant inconvenience and embarrassment for Swami Kriyananda, which sorted itself out. About 4 days later, he perceived that she was still moping about. He said, "What are you so upset about? Why are you behaving like that?" She said, "Oh, because I wasn't thinking and I caused you all that problem." He said, this was his response, "How egoic." Egoic? I mean, she got her attention, egoic, but I feel terrible. You know, I think I'm the last thing is from ego, because look how down I am on myself. Well, he answered in several ways. He says, egoism, meaning egocentricity, is just not seeing yourself in honest proportion. It's when you make yourself too important in the whole equation. That's part of it. And then he said, you made a mistake, he said, and you're apparently so shocked that you made a mistake that 4 days later you're still worshiping it, right? He said, of course you made a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. But if we're so proud and think we're so perfect, that's when we get so excited when those mistakes are revealed. If instead we just have a calm understanding that I'm doing my best and naturally I'm not able to be perfect yet, and oh look, I just learned some area in which I have to work. And we just look at it, you know, put it back and then start working with it, instead of becoming so emotional about having an emotion that we separate ourselves even more from the source. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, questions now. Yes?
The conflict thing, the person you were in conflict with,
Yes.
finally how did you deal with it?
Grace. That was the beginning of grace, though, when I had to honestly admit to myself that I enjoyed the conflict. I kept saying that I didn't, but one day I realized that I did. Because when we're not getting anything from a situation anymore, we always put it down. I mean, we always let it go. When I was caught in an emotional state, once my friend said to me, "And then how is this serving you?" And when she asked that question, it was actually a very interesting question. You know, what benefit are you getting from this? Which I was describing as terrible. What benefit are you getting? Wow. I stopped and thought about that, and I saw all the ways in which I was getting benefit from it. None of it was wholesome, but it was still benefiting me. In that particular conflict, I got to always have this little feeling, which, you know, I liked, of being misunderstood, you know? So delicate, so wise, but misunderstood, you know? It was very real. And when I sat in front of my altar and really realized that I liked this conflict because it allowed me to play that role over and over again, then I repudiated that. See, I'd been concentrating on the wrong thing. I'd been concentrating the whole time on the other person, their behavior toward me, my behavior toward them. It had never crossed my mind to look at how this was working for me, what this was giving me. And the source of it was my own enjoyment of being misunderstood because of all the, you can see all the where that would go. And as soon as I did that, truthfully, the grace of God descended and it evaporated. Just like evaporated. But for this hour was I born. The conflict itself, you see, this was what was so interesting. Conflict was nothing in itself. It was what I had to understand about myself. And the conflict was going to go on and on and on and on, and I was going to think it was external. But when I finally understood it was about my own consciousness, this is what for those of you who were there last night, we reach this stage of development where we realize our happiness comes from learning to control ourselves. And when I finally saw what part of me I was indulging, then the conflict, there was no need for it in my life anymore because I had learned from it. Well, to be truthful, we don't always understand each other because we're different. But the conflict is gone. We still don't always agree, but the energy of it is gone, the emotion is gone.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to ask this. Being disinterested, I don't know what exactly an emotion it is, but if you're very, very, very disinterested in yourself and the things around you for some phase in your life, in some period, continuously, what is it exactly and where does it fit in the tree?
If you're disinterested.
In yourself, plus whatever things, you don't even want to answer anybody and just shut yourself up in somewhere, for some time.
Last night, when I was talking about stages of development, the lowest stage of development is indifference. And the lowest stage of development is when we try to ease our pain by dulling our awareness of the world around us. I was speaking of using devices like television or drugs or alcohol, but another way to dull our awareness of the world around us is simply to refuse to engage in the world around us. I don't know you, so I'm not necessarily answering you, but I'm answering the question you asked. Very often in life, people wait to be interested before they put out energy. And they don't understand that if you don't put out energy, nothing will ever have magnetism. And that is the progression I was describing last night, from the lowest level of indifference to at least becoming self-centered, and realize that if I put out energy, then I get some energy back, and that when I experience that, I find that's actually more satisfying than merely being indifferent. Now, vairagya is something else. Vairagya is a genuine, spiritually elevated detachment from this world. But certainly the great saints qualify as having genuine detachment from this world, but they have a duty, and they carry out their duty with complete commitment. If you're just sitting on the sidelines, it's not likely, and I won't speak to you personally, but in principle, it's not likely that you have actually transcended. It's more likely that there is a kernel of some anxiety, or a kernel of an unwillingness to put out energy, or a kernel of misunderstanding of what true spirituality looks like. Now, to answer that more truthfully for you, to be fair to you, I would have to really understand what the whole reality is. But the principle of what you've described is actually a very real principle, and we mustn't think that we're advanced because we're indifferent. We're often indifferent because we're suppressed, and we're suppressed for probably very good reason. Probably the last time, or many last times, when we allowed our energy to flow, it got us into so much pain that the only solution we can have is that first level of dealing with pain, which is I'm going to dull my experience because I can't bear to have that happen to me again. So it takes a certain amount of courage to start moving out again. So merely because I say that's the first level of the 4 that I described last night, I don't disrespect that. That's a very deep and serious issue. And one has to begin then to learn to put out energy. Whenever anyone comes into the context of Ananda, we've only been a few years here, but you all are beginning to see it. But if you go to Ananda Village or any place of Ananda, we are just doing stuff all the time. We're always active. And Swami Kriyananda, in his younger years, he was just creating project after project after project and just making us do stuff all the time because we needed to put out energy. We needed to find out what happened when we put out energy. We needed to not be suppressed. We needed to move. And people would rebel against it, and people would leave because their way of dealing with things was to keep more control over what was happening rather than be able to get into a flow like that. And all of it was to move us through those stages that I was talking about last night. So high energy, there's 8 manifestations of God, and one of them is power and energy. And you have to learn to do all of them. You can't just be loving if there's no power behind that love. So sometimes you have to concentrate on one or the other in order to be wholly successful. Does that help? Yeah. Well, Sumitab, since you've asked before, let me Vijay answer.
Why energy is divided into female and male energy? What is the reason? Energy.
Well, everything emanates from, this is me talking about what the masters say, because I have no direct realization of this. The way Swami, Master, everyone explains it, that there is actually only one reality, and that all of this is an illusion created because the one began to vibrate as sound and as light. And the nature, if it's still and it vibrates, it has to go equally both directions. Duality is the nature of creation, and male and female, positive and active and receptive, however you call that, is the beginning of it. You know, they're just the infinite beyond creation is the masculine principle. It comes into creation, and that's the feminine principle, the Divine Mother. The Divine Mother makes creation with the power received from the masculine, from the Infinite Father. Asking why is, that's explaining how it's explained. Asking why we ever got into this in the first place is totally beyond me. But everything is duality. You see it everywhere. But your goal as a devotee is to come right back to center. So everything must resolve within oneself. The Nayaswami vow says, I will never marry, but if I am married, I will see that my partner belongs only to thee, and in any case, I will resolve all dualities within myself. And so that we won't look to marriage to resolve it, we resolve it within ourselves.
It is because of the environment we live, so we get that energy, or because of...
It's because we're not God realized. Once you're not one with the infinite spirit, you're in duality. There's no creation without duality. Duality is also an important principle because you can never just get it to this side and hold it. You can never just get this leaf completely organized and make it stay there, because everything that is born dies, everything that is created is unmanifested after time. There's no fixed eternity except for the one. So that's one of the things that we do. We get it finally set up, and then something happens. And that's, after a while, we stop trying to build a universe here. We stop identifying with this universe. We identify with the root and the center. We call it the spine. But then from there we go as far as we want. But we always know who we are. And so whatever happens out here, it all comes back to here. Yes, Gorja.
One question. For being impersonal with people, do we have to have a realization of a higher self, or can anybody do it?
Well, to be impersonal with other people, the more it is your genuine consciousness, the more powerful and sincere it will be. To be impersonal can also fall into the category of what we're talking here, where we're impersonal, but what we're actually is afraid. And if the seed point of the energy is fear, no matter how we have disguised it, what we're expressing is fear. So to be truly impersonal, Swamiji clarifies that, because what the person that we're impersonal about is ourself, which is to say, I'm not looking for anything from you. I don't need anything from you. I'm enjoying you, I'm giving to you, I'm loving you, I'm taking care of you, but I'm not looking for anything for myself. This is last night talking about the third level of development, where I have mastery over myself, and I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. Most of us live at the merchant level. I'm loving you because you're going to love me back. And sometimes we try to say that we're impersonal, but what we're really afraid is that if I really love you and you don't love me back, that's going to break my heart. So where we train ourselves is to understand where our happiness comes from. Even when I was a young girl, in my teens, and in America, you're allowed to have boyfriends and experiences like that. but it always seemed to me, what did you have to lose by loving someone? And I wasn't, I didn't live a life that I'm ashamed of or anything like that. But I just thought, what do you have to lose by loving someone? Just love them. They love you back or they don't. And the other side of it is, when you just love people like that, and they love you back or they don't, they tend to love you because it's very attractive. Because you're not in it for yourself. And I would, try to help my girlfriends and through college and even later, like, what do you have to lose? If this is sincerely how you feel, just feel that way. But if you identify with the emotion of how it's all going to come out, then that is indeed a terrifying prospect. So I suggest you practice when it's easier. Love your pets, love your girlfriends, love your mother, then step out a little to your friends. But even in all those relationships, strive to be a little bit impersonal about it. I'm doing this because it makes me happy and it's the right thing to do. And how they treat me, if the people around you are really treating you badly, find new friends. It's not like you just let people run all over you. That's not appropriate. To allow people to treat you wrongly is not being impersonal. That's being, and there's another word I'll use. The word I want is, we always need to behave appropriately. And speaking of appropriate, I'm going to give you guys a short break. We have only, can you last another 40 minutes or should I give you a short break? Would you like a little break? No. Some yes, some no. Why don't we get,
make it very fast.
let's do 5 minutes. Okay, here's my rules for breaks. You may get air, I don't know if there's tea out there. Do not start any new realities. Do not start big conversations, do not go shopping, do not make plans for later. Just breathe for a couple of minutes and come right back, okay? So this has been an extremely satisfying few days here. Everybody has, apparently I had this astral picture which I didn't even know about. This is not a small house, but a relatively small house in a walled garden. I've been living in a small house with a walled garden and I have just felt happy every day. Really enjoy it. I'm very sorry not to be able to stay here forever, but okay, get them back on again.
Well, Asha, perhaps this can be arranged.
It can be arranged, not a problem for me. We've been trying to use Brian as a decoy. He had a very slight cold when we arrived, so we've been composing telegrams. Brian, too sick to move, must stay. Must stay in Delhi 2 more months. But it's just a fantasy, it's not a real thought. All right, are you ready? During the break, I was asked essentially the same question in about 5 different ways, which was also the question exactly where I wanted to go. So I'm just going to start by expressing all of that because I think it will answer a lot of the questions. The obvious question over and over again is, this is a great theory, but how do we work with it? Someone was talking about, if you have an attachment or an identification out here and it's taken away from you, among the natural responses are resentment, anger, grief. Grief is a natural reaction. Even resentment, even anger are natural ways to feel. That's what I was saying earlier. You cannot be at war with yourself. You cannot observe the way that you feel and then just be angry at yourself for feeling it. That's called having a complex. And it's bad enough that you have the initial difficulty, but if you go to war with yourself over the difficulty, then you still have the initial difficulty, but now you have a complex about it. And having a complex over what is an understandable response makes it infinitely worse. Swami Kriyananda has the ability to be everybody's best friend, even over the years when 2 people had exactly conflicting points of view about situations. I was in a project. I was totally convinced this was the way to do it. Many other people were totally convinced that that was the worst possible thing that we could do. And Swamiji managed to make all of us feel supported by him. And his wonderful phrase was, I understand why you feel that way. He actually conceded nothing, but he really did understand why you feel that way. And the way that the effect that it had on all of us made me realize what a useful thing that is for oneself. Well, I understand why you feel that way. That situation in your life, that person in your life, that experience, it was very precious and wonderful to you. And now that it's gone, you're upset because it's gone. You say to yourself, I understand why you feel that way. And even just giving yourself permission to feel that way is the beginning of asking yourself then, well, is this making me happy? Is there something else we can do about it? And we also have to realize that because I understand why you feel that way, because something beautiful was taken away from you, some deep desire was thwarted, somebody that you relied upon has betrayed you, all kinds of things happen, I understand why you feel that way. So one of the ways to deal with pain, there's many ways to deal with pain. First is, don't run away from it. Don't try to deal with it by dulling your consciousness of it. That's the first, level of dealing with life, is that I'll dull myself. I'll pretend I don't feel this. But you do. It just goes underground, and now you have a complex on top of it. The best way I've found for dealing with pain is to have a sense of proportion about it. Now, when we suffer really intensely, it's always because whatever has happened has completely absorbed our field of vision. Isn't that true? Someone that we loved has died, and now this is the only thing we can see. All we see is their absence. A desire that I had wasn't fulfilled, all we see is its absence. Now, if a loved one has died, if circumstances in life have been changed by the government, all kinds of things. I knew a woman from Nicaragua, they went from being the wealthiest family in Nicaragua to being on welfare. Just their whole lives were wiped out by the government and by the lack of government and all those sorts of things. So it doesn't change. This Iranian woman I met who was working as a store clerk in California, she talked to me about the fact that she grew up with so much wealth. She didn't, she never picked up her dirty clothes off the floor, and now she had to work as a store clerk. She was very unhappy about it. There was no reconciling that. There was no way to say, oh, that's not so bad. Now you have this dull, dead-end job, and you used to live like a queen. It would just be fatuous of me to say, oh, well, you shouldn't be upset about that. It's black. There it is, it's black. And if someone you wanted to have in your life for a long time is gone because they've died, it's black. And don't try to say it's not. It's black. But the question is, where does it sit in the context of your life? You can't erase it. But what you can do is you can make a much bigger reality around it. If you have, as I'm saying, if you're looking at it like this, that's what it looks like. If I hang it on the wall, if I sit it in the middle of this board, it hasn't changed at all, has it? But the proportion of your life in relation to it has shifted. And this is something you can do very consciously. Of course, you should practice when it's easier. You should practice seeing everything in right proportion. And this is the way you see you don't suppress your actual appraisal of it. And you don't try to solve it with a platitude. Oh, everything happens for the best. It was perfect that happened. No, actually, it was really, really lousy that it happened. And I would never have chosen it. However, I had many good years before this happened. Perhaps there's a new reality that's coming to me that I didn't know anything about. I've had many experiences of how God helps me through these other realities. I had all my love focused in this, and now I have the opportunity to learn to love in a broader way. Whatever actually works for you. A woman friend of mine whose husband died, she laughed. People used to say to her, I'm so sorry you lost your husband. Her response was, He was not my wallet that I left at the market, she said. I didn't lose him. In fact, she said, I know exactly where he is. She says, he's just not here with me anymore. But I know, I love that. She was very feisty. But she was also very sad, extremely sad, because they had had a very happy time together. He was ill, but she had no idea he was about to go to the astral world. Totally shocked her. Absolutely stunned her and everyone when he went to the astral world. But as a consequence, this entire other life opened up for her. I think I was speaking about this here. And so this never changed, but it began to sort of sit in this whole other world. And so she realized it would be, well, both dishonest and also profoundly ungrateful to insist that this was the only reality, when in fact there was a much bigger reality. Now, what I want to concede, and I think it's important, is whenever you go here, it may still make you weep. And to overcome the pain doesn't mean that when you go here, you still don't weep. You know, even the masters weep, because sad things happen. But that's that's the incentive to go to God, is that sad things happen in this world. This is a duality. The world is duality here. You're never going to get it just to go to one side and sit there. It's always going to swing back. And it can be sad. So you just say, I understand why I feel that way. But I don't want to live there all the time. I want to live in a greater reality. Proportion is everything. A friend of mine, actually it was Jyotish. In the first round of building Ananda, we built these geodesic domes, and we didn't apparently know how to build them properly, and they just leaked like sieves. Just the rain would just pour in, and no matter what efforts we made to keep the rain from pouring in, and we had, in 6 months, we had 70 inches of rain during that time. It wasn't quite monsoon, but it was a lot of rain during those years. The climate has changed since. And Jyotish, he wasn't married to Devi yet. He was still living alone. He lived in one of these little domes that just leaked like crazy. And one night, our rainy season is winter, cold winter, so it's not just rain, it's cold. So it tended to leak mostly through the center ring of the dome. And Jyotish had found somewhere a funnel that was about a yard around. And he had rigged this funnel up on the ceiling with all this tubing that kind of went over like this, and then it went into the kitchen sink. And so the rain would mostly pour in through this funnel, go through this tubing, and then rush out through the sink. It sounded like a river running right through his house. But it mostly worked. And then we didn't have electricity in those days, and our lights were kerosene lights or propane gas lights. And Jyotish, it was a very simple little house, and he had a comfortable chair, and he had a propane light, and he would sit in the evening, and he would often read. And for some reason, I came over in the late afternoon. It was already dark, and he was sitting there, and he had a wood fire stove, and he was warm, and he was reading, and this rushing river was just pouring in through the top and going out like that. I just said, Jyotish, how can you stand this? And he answered me. He said, this is the way I think about things. He said, some things are permanent. If something is permanent, it's hard to handle. But if it's temporary, you can put up with a situation that's temporary. And then he said, and then I realized everything is temporary. Just like that. In truth, a couple of years later, that house burned to the ground. So that was how he solved it. It was just over. In fact, that's how he told Devi that their house is burned down. Devi, no more problem with leaks. That was how he told her that their house and everything in it had gone to ash. Okay? Proportion. If it's temporary, why am I so upset about it? And truthfully, everything is temporary. Now, he has an enormously philosophical mind. He can go there. Not all of us could go that far. I would have had to find another way probably to fix the house. But see it in proportion. Swami Kriyananda tells a story, and these are all sort of jokes. One of his fellow disciples was a man named Norman Paulson. And Norman had a tendency to be depressed and a tendency to have heavy moods. And Norman was in one of his really heavy moods And Swami Kriyananda wanted to help him. He said, Norman, I know you're feeling badly, but how long can it last? 40, 50 years? Meaning, you're a disciple, it'll go away, maybe this whole lifetime. And Norman, instead of being comforted, just looked at him with horror, as Swami said, and ran screaming from the room. But to Swami, that seemed like, so for the rest of your incarnation, eventually it'll go away. Now, what creates the right proportion for you is your choice. But I think if you don't try to make that which is black white, but just build a bigger and bigger context around it. So my husband is a disappointment. I have wonderful children. So I'm alone now. Well, that gives me all the freedom that I wanted to have. So I'm not as pretty as I used to be, so I don't have to be so superficial. So now I'm old and I just get to sit quietly by myself, more time to meditate. So I put my faith in people who betrayed me. Well, at least I've learned. Doesn't change the black, but it changes the way you feel about it. And what that is, you see, ultimately, is that you see everything in the context of God, and these spots get so small that even though they're still there, they just don't affect you in the same way. Does that make sense? It's extremely important. These are all things that, you see, these are all about, speaking of last night, which not all of you were there, this is all about the third stage of dealing with pain. We understand that it's not about controlling the world, which is the second stage, it's controlling our response to the world. And sooner or later, that's where we have to be. That's the battle of Kurukshetra, the real battle. Okay? Now, pain, proportion, and now comes the word appropriate, because this was also questions I was asked. We have to, I'm going to go right back to where I started. Remember, spiritual life is not about putting on the outside a certain way of behaving. Sometimes we're trying to, not to be detached, but what we really are is unafraid. Sometimes we're looking indifferent, but we really have a lack of energy to put into things. So the goal of the spiritual path is not to be nice. It's not really to just always be nice and always be accepting and never have any needs or desires of our own and just let everyone take advantage of us and always be the one who's sacrificing. That's not necessarily spiritual at all. What is spiritual is to behave appropriately in every situation. This is where Sri Yukteswar, he wasn't speaking exactly of this, but he told Master he had to learn to behave. You have to learn to behave appropriately. If someone is mistreating you, you have to, and that's one more thing I want to say about appropriate. Appropriate is to act for the best welfare of everyone involved, including yourself. And this is how you also become impersonal about yourself. You're not more important than the people in your family or the people in your company or your friend. You're not more important, but neither are you less important. Everything has to be just in exact proportion. And if we're always making ourselves less important, we're actually being quite personal about ourselves in the guise of being impersonal, because we're not really looking at things in proper proportion. We're not really looking at it from God's point of view. From God's point of view, everybody's the same, and we're all here to grow. We're all here to learn whatever it is that we're trying to learn, and our job is to help ourselves and everybody who comes under our influence to learn what they're trying to learn. So we need to behave in an appropriate way to help ourselves and others learn what they need to learn. Now, sometimes the people around us have absolutely no interest in learning anything. So what is appropriate is to stop trying to teach them, right? But if people are really mistreating you, even if, as I was asked during the break, you can understand that it's really their negative energy, their negative cause. Some of you have heard this on other recordings of mine, but I had such a perfect experience of that. My husband and I traveled in a motorhome just before we started the colony, the community where we now live. We went for a 3-month lecture tour around the western United States in a big motorhome. It was big enough to have a bedroom in the back and a kitchen. It was wonderful. And he would drive, And sometimes I would be messing around in the back, and I was making a peanut butter sandwich. And I had a jar of peanut butter about this big that weighed about 1.5 pounds. It was completely full. And it was a slightly curvy road, and he actually drifted a little over, saw that he was drifting, and made a slightly sharp turn, which caused that jar to slide right off the counter like that and land square on my foot. And it hurt. It really did. Fortunately, it didn't do anything more than make a little bruise, but it hurt. The instant I felt that physical pain in my foot, I had an almost irresistible desire to yell at him. And I could see that somehow I thought if I passed on to him the pain I had in my foot, I would have less pain in my foot. Now, I didn't realize, and he didn't tell me for many, many weeks, that he had, in fact, lost his attention, his concentration, and it was his fault that the peanut butter jar fell. But I didn't know that. I just thought it had just happened. But I didn't yell at him because some part of me noticed in that split second that my foot would still hurt. And then he would be upset. And then where would we go from there? So a lot of times when people are treating you badly, they imagine, and this is one of the most interesting and horrible delusions of this life, that if I have pain and then I make you hurt, then I'll hurt less. Extremely peculiar delusion, but a very strong one. So sometimes you can easily understand. But that still doesn't mean it's appropriate for you to allow them to just keep acting that out on you. Because as long as that works for them, why would they ever learn anything? And so a lot of times people will say, oh, my son bullies me, my husband is very unkind to me. And I say, well, it's working for him. Why would he stop? So some woman was speaking to me about that fact that whenever she tries to get her son to do something, he's just started bullying them. And she says, how can I get him to stop? Well, you go along with him. Every time he bullies you, you give in. So why would he change? It's if it works, he's doing it. Now, sometimes situations are complicated and you can't really get out of it so easily, but you have to always think what is appropriate in this situation, considering myself impersonally. Now, a lot of times you have to balance. Like little children tend to be extremely selfish about the needs of their parents. But it's not appropriate to say to a 6-year-old, Mommy has her own life, and I'm just going to leave you here and not feed you for 3 days because I need to go somewhere. The child can't even begin to understand that, so you don't say that. That's not appropriate. You have to figure out what this person can really understand and what will really help them. But you can't do it if you can't do it. Maybe it would be lovely if you were able to sacrifice yourself joyfully for the welfare of someone else. But if it is not a joyful self-offering, then it's not appropriate. So for the best welfare of everyone concerned, including yourself, which is seldom an absolute choice. Sometimes it's, there is no good choice, but this is the least terrible one. And we just have to take it. Maybe we just have to allow this person to just continue to act out their delusion because there's no way I can tell them. I was speaking to someone who was saying, wives nagging husbands, parents nagging children is one of the most common, repetitive, useless actions. Okay? It's appropriate, perhaps, that the husband or the wife change or that the child behave differently. But if all that's happening is just repeated, wasted energy with absolutely no result, it's not appropriate just to keep demeaning yourself by doing that. We have to just decide what the right value is here. To put up with this, to find a new strategy. It's like you can't just keep doing something that doesn't work and thinking that the next time it's going to work. You have to ask, why am I doing this? Is this really helping this person? Or is just that I am so restless that I can't control my energy in this matter? You see, what will really help? From Swami Kriyananda is the one that I have learned this. He has nothing at stake and he's not restless inside. He's not restless. He doesn't need anyone in the world to be different than they are. He doesn't need to pass along any anxiety of his own to anyone. He's perfectly content. His only desire is to help. And therefore, in every situation, he just looks and thinks, how can I help? And oftentimes, you can't help. They're just going to go on doing what they're doing until they're done. In my community once, somebody came to me and they were really complaining about somebody else's behavior. And that person's behavior really was unfortunate, which is also another nice word. It's unfortunate. Swamiji once said about an absolutely insufferable person, yes, they do have an unfortunate manner about them. I love that. I use it a lot now. Yes, he does have an unfortunate manner. It just puts it in proportion. He's still a child of God. He's still a sincere devotee, but he does have an unfortunate manner. And this person had an unfortunate manner, and somebody came to complain. I said, here's an idea. Let's take them out into the center of the community and let's have an execution. You know? Because naturally it would be lovely if this person could overcome this fault. And naturally it's annoying, but they're not going to change because there's nothing we can do to make them change. We've tried, everybody's trying. So the only thing I can think of is to just kill them and then we won't have to deal with them anymore, right? Sometimes you have to say something absurd to realize, oh, well, that's not appropriate. You know, an execution is not appropriate. But if there's no way to help them, then you have to come to a more appropriate response within yourself. Whether that means you separate yourself from someone who consistently treats you in an inappropriate way, or whether that means you find a way, you do battle with your own inclination and come to peace with it. But sometimes standing up really strongly, Swami Kriyananda never allows himself to be bullied just because people want to. He was following a certain program of fresh juices, and he had a certain regimen he wanted to follow, and to this day I have no idea why I did this, but I wanted him to follow a slightly different regimen. I disagreed with the protocol. And I explained to him why I disagreed with the protocol. He told me clearly he wanted to follow the one he was following. I was making the juice for him and I made it the way I wanted it. You know, sometimes just complete idiocy comes over it. I put it on his table and he knew that I had done it. He never looked at it or touched it. But nor did he say anything to me. Just nothing. You know, he wasn't going to try. He'd already tried to persuade me and I had showed myself pig-headed and I wasn't going to listen. But at the same time, nor was he going to give in. Because why should he? It'd be completely inappropriate for him to allow me to bully him. And so if somebody's trying to bully you and you can't reason with them and you can't argue with them, you don't necessarily have to reason or argue with them, but nor do you have to go along with them either. Ideally, of course, you remain calmly centered. I'll tell you the story of one of my dear friends, Paula. Our friend Mary Shraddha was her name. Shraddha was dying of cancer. She was quite young, in her 30s. She'd had a very tempestuous relationship with her father named Jake. Her father was Jake, and had done her best to get independence from Jake. Both Jake and Shraddha were very, very feisty characters, so there was a lot of love that expressed in a very tempestuous way. When she became ill and was dying, he was devastated. As you can well imagine, she was staying in our community and he had come to stay with her. Paula, Susan, and I wanted to go see Shraddha. So we telephoned and Jake answers the phone. And Paula says, Jake, we'd like to come see Shraddha. Shraddha's not feeling very well. She shouldn't have any visitors. And he slams the phone down. The three of us talk and say, Shraddha spent a lot of her life making sure that Jake didn't control her life. So probably she would like to see us whether Jake wants to see us or not. So we made the decision that we would go. So fortunately, I had the sense to stand way back and let Paula be in the front. So we knock on the door. Yeah, I apprenticed myself to Paula. The door opens, Jake's at the door. Jake, talk about pain that he wanted to pass on. He saw a way to pass on the pain. Why are you here? I told you not to come. Just like that. Paula says, oh, Jake, we just had to come. That's all she said. Jake rails at her again. Oh, Jake, we just had to come. They did it 3 times. Then Jake says, all right, just don't stay very long. Just like this. Right? She didn't fight him, but she didn't let him bully her either. Now, Paula was as sweet as a rasgulla. You know how you squeeze a rasgulla and all that sugar pours out? You know, if I'd been there, Jake would have found somebody to fight with. And we would have never gotten in the house. But Paula behaved perfectly appropriately. I'm sorry, Jake. You don't control me or your daughter anymore. We're here and we belong in this house. But why should she fight him? Because he wasn't going to learn anything from her either. She just stood right here, did exactly what she needed to do, and in a strange way it just opened the door, because it often does. Because especially when people are behaving inappropriately, it's going way back to when my friend wrote to Swami about this impossible man. Oh, he just wants to be your friend, just love him. Almost always that's what they want. What everyone wants. Can we always do it? No, not always. Sometimes we've got to fight our own battles out. Someone asked the question also, what if the pattern, the karmic pattern is repeating and repeating and repeating? I was born into a family that was a very good family, but their particular faults absolutely made my faults worse. And when I learned about karma, I thought to myself, why wasn't I born somewhere that balanced my faults instead of making them worse? It really confused me for a while. Then I finally realized, because they were made worse, they got so bad that I had to notice, and I had to do something about it. If it had been just a little less right in my face, I would have been able to just slip away again. Because we all like to fall down to that lowest level where we just dull our minds to it and don't really have to deal with it. Isn't that so? So when we're having a repeating pattern, it's very simple. Okay, now is the moment. This is trying to get bad enough that the pain of enduring it is greater than the imagined pain of trying to change it. Because we'll stick with something as long as we think we can get away with it. And you have to just ask God, and it's not always simple. Why is this continually happening to me? And I suggest to you again what I said. And how is it benefiting me? What do I get to indulge by going through this over and over again? And it takes time, but we have all the time in the world. We have infinity to get this correct. It's just a question of how long we want to suffer. Well, dear friends, that brings us to the end of our time, and I think that will probably have to do for today. Even though I think we could spend a lot of time together and still enjoy it, I really want to honor what we promised. So God bless you all. Thank you so much for coming. It's really been a treat.